Good afternoon to all of you. Today we are going to talk about another falsehood told over time about the Fiat 42, and in general about all Italian fighters up to the 5th series, that is, that the armament composed of two 12.7mm Breda Safat machine guns housed in the fuselage above the engine of the single-engine fighters was a terrible armament, and that the fighters of the palace particularly suffered from this inferiority compared to enemy fighter aircraft. Nothing could be more false, and we will also see why. The 12.7 Breda Safat was a heavy aerial machine gun, more reliable at the beginning of the conflict than equivalent weapons present in all the most advanced nations from an aviation point of view. It was even more reliable than the famous Browning of the same caliber from which it was initially derived. The latter had a more powerful launch charge and a higher rate of fire, but reached the reliability of the Breda and then actually surpassed it given the investments dedicated to it only close to the entry of the United States into the war, and even later there were further modifications. The reliability that we now recognize in the Browning 12.7mm, we mean ex-military we know, was achieved only in the 50s. So much so that the RAF, which received from the United States aircraft with the Lend-Lease law, also armed with this machine gun, in some types preferred to convert the armament, where possible, to the American 7.7mm Browning machine guns with Vickers bullets that were less powerful than the original American bullets. Among other things, this proves that these machine guns mounted on the examples of English aircraft captured or supplied to other nations demonstrated reduced reliability until 1942. I am talking precisely about the Browning 7.7mm with Vickers ammunition, but we will see that later. It was not for reasons of standardization, but precisely because of jams. So much so that there are the results of tests conducted in British arsenals for this very purpose. So the 12.7mm Breda Safat was much more powerful, with a much greater range and with much greater destructive capacity compared to the 7.7mm Browning machine guns with Vickers ammunition that were mounted on British fighter aircraft and also on bombers. A fighter aircraft must bring itself to what is called the attack circle to begin the attack. That is, it must bring itself to the mathematical place, which is actually a circle, on which the fighter must be in order to begin its fire action against the enemy aircraft. The radius of this circle corresponds to the average distance from which fire is opened, which does not correspond to the maximum range of the weapons on board, but to a much shorter distance than this. The center of the attack circle is the point of encounter between the projectiles and the position that the enemy aircraft will assume. Distance that will be covered in the time needed to reach the interception point, given that the enemy aircraft is moving at a certain speed. Therefore, This attack circle is nothing other than the intersection between the plane containing the attacking aircraft and the attacked aircraft at the moment in which the projectile meets the attacked aircraft. A plane that intersects the so-called attack sphere. That is, the locus of points that the attacking aircraft can occupy, considering what the attack radius is at a given moment. In fact, an aircraft can approach another in 3 dimensions, and therefore there is an attack sphere, not simply an attack circle. Keeping the enemy at this distance means keeping him in an area where he cannot harm the attacking aircraft. Since the British aircraft attacked was armed with 7.7mm machine guns that were ineffective in tests conducted on the ground already at 180 meters of distance. This observation had caused dismay, especially among the British. The Germans and the Italians also realized that the best projectile that the English weapon had available was the incendiary one that needed at least 5 hits on an unprotected tank to actually produce a fire, and only 1 or at most 2 of the 6 or 8 machine guns of a British fighter aircraft fired incendiary projectiles. So of the small amount of shots that the 6 or 8 weapons mounted on the British fighters exploded in a fight, few were effective. Among other things, I remind you that the Italian aircraft were all equipped with self-sealing tanks, contrary to what happened, especially the first series, in the English aircraft. So it took not the 5 hits I was referring to before to ensure a fire, but at least 10 hits to start it, which made the armament of the British fighters even less efficient than the standard one on the Italian fighters. The other types of rounds available to British machine guns were much less effective. For example, the armor-piercing ones on paper were capable of penetrating 12mm A of armor at 180 meters. In reality, they were deflected or overturned during flight, so much so that only a third or even a quarter of the A was stopped by the already very modest armor of 4 mm. The effective range of British machine guns was therefore not 180 meters, but as much as 160 meters. In reality, beyond that they were practically useless. So British aircraft had to get very close to an Italian aircraft to hope to be successful. Think that the RAF realized this during the Battle of Britain, where its fighter aircraft returned at first, having fired all their shots with very poor results on the aircraft of the Luftwaffe. It was noticed that the convergence of the projectile beams, since the British machine guns were placed on the wings of the aircraft, had been adjusted to 360 meters away, making them ineffective given the gigantic dispersion in combat, which brought only a quarter of the beam to arrive in the convergence zone, and among other things with kinetic energy of only 1/3 on average. So they were quickly adjusted to converge at only 180 meters. That is to say half, effectively obtaining better results. The Fiat CR42 had a speed, an effective range, that is the one that effectively brought the kinetic energy needed to attack the opponent, of 450 meters. We are talking about more than double what was the effective range of the British weapons. This allowed to target the enemy aircraft from a distance and with appropriate maneuvers keep it at a distance such as not to let it get below 180 meters, where the British fighter actually became very dangerous. As for dispersion, that is what happens when shooting bursts against a target in the same conditions with the same armament, resulting in the projectiles going on different trajectories than those that would take them to the targeted object. I want to say a little more about this dispersion. It is due to the variation of the initial velocity of the projectile, as well as to the variation of the weight of the launching charge, to the variation of the reaction of the explosive charge due to the temperature oscillations in the barrel of the machine gun that is firing. Furthermore, dispersion is due to the small variations in weight and shape of the projectiles due to imperfect construction and to the different density of the layers of the atmosphere that are crossed by the projectile in different shooting conditions. From the projectile and also from the wind that may have acted on the projectile itself along the trajectory, and therefore also the aerodynamics of the projectile which, as you can imagine, varies greatly in a machine that moves quickly at different altitudes and with sudden maneuvers. Furthermore, the badly estimated firing distance, in a necessarily heated fight, had to be corrected with the collimator. Therefore the total dispersion added up all these partial dispersions to which I referred, and we tried to limit it both by reducing at an industrial level the tolerances of the weight of the charges, of the launch of the projectiles, of the tolerances of the weight and of the shape of the projectile itself, but also through the training of the pilot in shooting and in the correction to be carried on the collimator. Therefore, by operating an accurate collimation on the ground of the embarked weapons, and trying to increase the rate of fire as much as possible in order to obtain the densest possible shooting patterns, in order to hit the target with more shots useful for its destruction. The average shooter of a Fiat CR42 was able to place approximately 70% of the shots at a distance of 500 meters of useful range in a fight with a weapon such as the Breda 12.7mm machine gun mounted on the aircraft we are referring to. So, we have to think that calculated that each single Breda Safat with caliber 12.7mm fired 570 rounds per minute, taking into account the synchronization mechanism with the propeller. We had 70% of 1140 rounds per minute, given that there were two weapons that fired in the Italian fighters. So about 800 rounds arrived on a target in a minute at 500 meters away from the Fiat CR42, which was the standard armament at least until the end of 42 on all Italian fighters. Now, considering that it was necessary to shoot down a bomber about half a kilogram of explosive that arrived on its body, to have a good chance of shooting down an enemy fighter, a smaller amount of explosive was needed to bring into contact with the enemy fighter aircraft, which can be thought of as about 200 grams of explosive. This quantity of explosive was determined to be sufficient to produce such damage, even if the enemy aircraft was not hit in vital parts, to to at least force a landing and render it inactive, but often also to destroy it, especially in the first 2 years of the war, where British fighters, as I said, were largely not equipped with self-sealing tanks. Therefore a quantity of explosive carried, especially in places where the tank housings were located, was almost always lethal. I can therefore affirm that the Breda's incendiary shells were remarkably effective, as were the explosive shells. Well, 200 grams of explosive were obtained with about 250 rounds from the guns of a Fiat CR42. So a burst of at least 20 seconds from the 2 Fiat guns was necessary to surely shoot down an enemy at a distance of between 160 and 500 meters from the Italian aircraft. Range of distances in which, in a duel with a British aircraft, the Italian fighter would have been relatively safe from being shot down, because, as I said, the British weapons were not effective in this range. You realize that this is a purely ideal discussion, given that, as far as dispersion is concerned, we have already said that it substantially limited the quantity that actually reached the target even for the 12.7 mm machine gun, which had a fairly flat trajectory of the projectiles. And even more so for the British weapons, which had a much higher dispersion, even if they acted within the 160 meters in which they were actually effective. Naturally, we are talking about a duel. Therefore an aircraft against an aircraft. Things would have been different if the Italian fighter had found itself in an unbalanced duel, in which the British targeted it with 2 or 3 aircraft, of which 1 or 2 had approached to within 160 meters of the Italian aircraft. In fact, this is precisely what the RAF techniques aimed at in order to shoot down the Italian aircraft, that is, to concentrate with sections of 2 or 3 aircraft in order to approach the Italian aircraft at less than 160 meters. Because it was impossible for the Italian pilot to control 2 or 3 opponents at the same time. In this way, at least 1 or even 2 of the aircraft of the British section were in a position to fire with all the weapons on board against the Italian aircraft. In order to reach the quantity of explosives needed to shoot it down at a distance, precisely, less than 160 meters, distance where the extremely high rate of fire of the 8 weapons of the British aircraft could actually get the better of the Italian fighters. I want to point out another statement that I often hear is completely false, that is, the statement that only the Regia Aeronautica was deceived by the sensational results that Italian aircraft had during the Spanish Civil War, which I remember ended in 1939. Contrary to what is commonly imagined, as is even reported in some supposedly historical books. Therefore, the information drawn from the air forces was absolutely reliable for the first part of the conflict. In fact, even the RAF was deceived by the fact that it believed that an automatic weapon of only 7.7 mm caliber, with high rate of fire, replicated in 6 or 8 units for fighters or blocks of 4 for bombers, would have allowed it to pour on the target a quantity of bullets sufficient to bring it down. in the extremely rapid time of ballistic contact in a duel. A belief also obtained from their evaluation of the duels seen in the Spanish skies, as can be read in the reports of British observers in the Spanish Civil War. The Regia Aeronautica, on the other hand, from these duels in the Spanish skies, realized that the 12.7 mm machine gun, developed by Breda and mounted on the Italian aircraft, allowed decisive results with just a few shots on enemy aircraft, whether they were fighters or bombers, and realized that the machine gun allowed them to hit them at considerable distances, without the Italian aircraft being hit by enemy machine guns, which were mostly 7.7 in caliber and even smaller. For example, some French aircraft such as the Du 18 had smaller calibers, but also in the Soviet aircraft. This is a very intelligent consideration that was made by the experts of the Regia Aeronautica in the skies of Spain, not falling into the same trap that the British experts had fallen into, not understanding, in fact, that the armament of the Italian fighters of 12.7 mm, mounted among other things in a position very close to the longitudinal plane of the aircraft, allowed, as mentioned, much greater ranges, power of the shot delivered much more significant. Given that the shot was more powerful than its own, it arrived with much greater precision than that which was allowed by the standard armament of the British aircraft. Furthermore, the fact of having to concentrate the fire of several machine guns on a point 160 meters away, given that the distance from the longitudinal plane of the British machine guns was much more consistent than that of the 12.7 Breda, which, I repeat, were almost very close to the longitudinal symmetry plane of the aircraft, allowed the Italian aircraft to have a lethal action space of the Fiat CR42 and other Italian fighters that used this armament, much more significant than what was allowed to British aircraft such as Hurricane, Gladiator, etc., and also for the fact, to which I referred, of the dispersion, another capital lie that is heard or read in the Vulgate of describing the armament of the Fiat CR42 as insufficient is to say that in 1941 the RAF already had aircraft armed with a 20 mm cannon that allowed it to defeat Italian fighters from a distance. In reality, the first British aircraft that operated in the Mediterranean and East African theatre of operations with efficient 20 mm cannons appeared in late 1942. And therefore the real inferiority from the point of view of the armament of the Italian fighters was recorded only from this moment. Until the advent of the Italian fighters of the 5 series, which allowed to rebalance or even reverse this relationship between the power of the embarked armament of the Italian fighters compared to the Allied ones, given the superior performance of the Mauser MG 151 cannon, compared to the British Hispano-Suiza and the variants that were developed from it. Going back in time, I want to make a small reference to what happened in the first days. In the first months of the Second World War, that is, those that were the first uses in the clashes between the French and the Germans of the 20mm cannons, for example. And also with the British, of course, only that the British did not have the 20mm cannon on their aircraft. For example, in the engine gun arrangement on French and German fighters, there were considerable problems from the point of view of jamming, so much so as to considerably limit their use. In fact, many pilots did not use the cannon at all, for fear of jamming, and even of the explosion of the barrel. Since the cannon was practically drowned between the cylinders and the mechanisms of the V-type engines that were, for example, on the French de Voisin 520 and on the Messerschmitt 109. Explosion of the barrel and the thermal interaction cannon engine caused a malfunction of the engine or even the destruction of the engine itself and therefore the loss of the fighter. Incidentally, the Luftwaffe sent reports to Messerschmitt, who remounted the 20 guns in the engine gun configuration, only after having obtained the perfect resolution of these malicious thermal interactions, which happened in late 1941, early 1942. So the problems of jamming of the gun, and also the changes in the firing speed, as well as the deformation of the projectile exiting the barrel, was solved only during 1941. When, for example, France had long since left the conflict, and therefore the Germans began to have at their disposal the Mauser MG11 cannon, which was much less affected by these problems than the MGFF, which had armed the first EHM Messerschmitt 109 equipped with a cannon in engine cannon arrangement. In fact, on the Messerschmitt 109 and on the other German aircraft which had this Mauser cannon assembly, as well as on our aircraft of the 5 series, they began to mount this Mauser cannon inside the engine. At this point, as far as the G55 and Reggiane 2005 fighters are concerned, they worked very well as on the Messerschmitt. While I remember that the Air Macchi 205 did not have this arrangement, but only had them on the wings. In fact, as I remember, it was an intermediate fighter between Series 2. So the Macchi 202 Folgore and the Reggiane 2001 and Series 5 obtained through the allocation of the Mauser inside the DB 605 engine that replaced the 601 of Series 1 and Series 2 of our fighters. The latter, these 2 series, let's say original, did not have the necessary spaces to house the cannon, projectiles, servo mechanisms, containers, projectiles and cartridges, which among other things had not been foreseen for use in these aircraft, because it was thought that the old armament of 2 Breda 12.7mm was still sufficient, and that the British were not able to deploy fighters with 20mm cannons in a short time. Which then did not happen because in 1942 they were actually deployed by the RAF and the RAF in Africa. The Allied aircraft, I would like to point out, did not mount the cannon inside the engines because the attempts to use this arrangement ended in catastrophes both in the United States and in Great Britain, another thing that is not remembered. So the cannons were mounted only on the wings of the Allied fighter aircraft, and even this information is not given, and not for the justification that is given. That is that the weapon was not compatible for use in the engine cannon configuration. Because as usual, in almost all the publications from the end of the war to a few years ago, only the information that portrays the American and British designers as absolutely incapable of mistakes has passed. When this thing is at least far from reality. So, I repeat, it is completely false that in 1941 the British already had at their disposal an armament superior to that of the Italian fighters. Summing up everything, it was seen, in the manuals of both the Regia Aeronautica and the German ones, how it was essential to attack the enemy aircraft within a very limited aperture cone. Possibly from behind, with the axis of the cone aimed at overlapping the axis of the enemy aircraft, in order to hit the target with the greatest possible part of the shots fired, and therefore reach the quantity of explosives necessary for its destruction. Not being able to act usefully above 160 meters by the British fighters, while the RAF imposed the combat technique of facing each Italian fighter, if possible only with sections of British fighters made up of at least 3 aircraft, in order to close it down under the distance of 160 meters. Unload as much as possible the onboard weapons against it, and therefore reach the quantity of explosives useful for shooting it down. Certainly with preference actually written to aim at the cockpit occupied by the pilot to get to kill him in the first instance, rather than destroy the aircraft, which was considered more difficult to obtain. Here I point out the term that is used and reported both in the pilots' diaries. So these pilots were actually given this absolutely necessary information, and in the operational manuals in order to shoot down Italian aircraft. And here I stop from a moral point of view, since the Regia Aeronautica, as far as I have heard from all the pilots I have dealt with, never passed on this information. Perhaps making a mistake, since as the French say, war is war. But anyway, besides the 20mm cannon, the other technological aid that allowed the field to be overturned and that arrived again in 1942 was the gyroscopic collimator that, as we will see in other videos dedicated to Axis aircraft, allowed Allied aircraft to use more elaborate and much more precise shooting techniques. Since it exceptionally reduced the error due to the human factor, thus decreasing the total dispersion of the shot. I would like to point out to you, of course, that in maneuvered combat things went differently from what was, let's say, the contact mode. Come shoot, move away, to frame the target in the collimator. The hunter was forced to fly on a curved trajectory that tightened as the distances between the two aircraft shortened. And among other things, under the additional strain due to the centrifugal accelerations that were undergone in these maneuvers, and therefore, during the tight combat turns, the angle at which the enemy aircraft appeared continually decreased, and the distance between the two aircraft also decreased. Therefore the accelerations undergone increased with a worsening of the hunter's aim, Not infrequently the firing action had to be interrupted, because accelerations were reached that were not physically manageable, in order to guarantee the perfect mental clarity necessary for collimation, especially if the combat altitudes were high. Despite the use of aids that gave oxygen to the pilot, I would also like to draw attention to another fact that is not talked about, namely that the 12.7 mm projectile was much less influenced by aerodynamic forces, allowing for a much higher precision of fire than that of the 7.7 type weapons, in which a significant percentage of the fired projectiles, especially during maneuvers, were dispersed in trajectories that were very different from those ideally predicted. Precisely because the projectile exiting the barrel and encountering the flow of external air was overturned by the aerodynamic forces in flight, substantially modifying the original trajectory. As the relative wind acted on the surfaces that were exposed to it, which were no longer those of the projectile's nose, but those of the projectile's side. A further observation that is not made by those who staunchly defend the armament of British fighters, which according to British experts themselves was considered highly insufficient. Among other things, this armament could not be changed because the British did not have a reliable 12.7 machine gun like the Italian Breda Safat, and did not have a reliable cannon to mount on airplanes until 1941. In fact, I still remember that the cannons available to the Allies were all derivatives of the Hispano-Suiza, which then derived from the Swiss 20mm Ukalion, which in turn derived from the German Becker of the First World War. The Hispano-Suiza in the models that went into series production up to and including 1941, had huge problems with regards to reliability, precision, and the tendency to jam. So much so that it was not considered suitable for hunting use, as it proved to be with the French fighters that mounted it in the first editions. And despite the fact that the French had already independently brought about significant modifications that had in any case increased its reliability before the war, compared to the models that were being tested in Great Britain. So in this video we have demonstrated that up until 1941 the armament of the Italian fighters was superior to that of the British fighters, and that even when the Italian fighters faced German aircraft, we are talking about the Messerschmitt 109, therefore equipped with the MGFF cannon I was saying, the Italian fighters proved superior even in this case. As I already mentioned in the first video dedicated to the Fiat CR42, referring to the clashes of the German fighter with the Belgian fighter mounted in part on the Fiat CR42. What allowed the British to prevail at this time over the Italian aircraft was the large quantity of aircraft available, which allowed them to face each Italian fighter in conditions of numerical superiority, such as to get to a firing range that allowed them to unload their weapons, where a direct confrontation between the Italian fighter and a British fighter would have resulted in the almost certain defeat of the British fighter even in the Hurricane and Spitfire series, because the Italian fighter had the possibility of hitting the British one at a greater distance. therefore maintaining this distance, and was embarrassingly superior in terms of maneuvering quality to the British aircraft. The Italian fighter would have prevailed over the British one in a 1-to-1 duel. Engaged without exploiting either the numerical superiority or the high-speed passage allowed to Hurricanes and Spitfires and Gladiators if the attack was carried out from higher altitudes in a dive. Above Fiat CR42s in level stationary formation. In most cases, however, the high-speed passage was insufficient to unload the number of shots necessary to shoot them down unless the pilot was hit. As was also demonstrated in the Battle of Britain and in many of the clashes that took place in the skies of Malta and Africa. We will end this episode here. Even if I will say other things later also about the armament in another episode of the Fiat CR42, but it is more useful in that episode rather than saying this other thing here. Thank you. I wish you a good evening. See you soon.